everyone. Welcome to Unit 3, Mod 9. Today we are talking about neurons and neurotransmitters. So here are your learning objectives. Pause it so you know what you are supposed to know. And here is your list of vocab. It is going to be okay. Just take a breath. Let it out slowly. And it's going to be okay. So everything psychological is biological. So this unit is really focusing on that biological piece of that biopsychosocial model. So when we think about the self, where is it located? Where do we perceive it? So Plato, going back to pre-scientific roots, Plato said the mind is in the brain. The self is in the brain. Aristotle differed with that, and he believed that the mind is in the heart. That's where feelings and emotions come from. And, most people talk about feelings coming from the heart, etc. But when we think about the self, according to research, most people today see it as coming from our brains. And Franz Gall in the early 1800s also focused on the head as a place for where the self is located. He created phrenology, which was they would study the bumps and spots on someone's head. So like the shape of it, shape of different areas on the head. And they would use this map, the one pictured here, to basically check for personality and character traits and mental abilities. And this is obviously completely discredited now. We do not use this. But that idea that personality and abilities come from the head is still with us today. So, who is studying this? So, biological psychologist is the umbrella term, and that's a vocab term. It's the umbrella term for anyone studying the biological aspect of psychology. So, behavior geneticists, neuropsychologists, biopsychologists, behavioral neuroscientists, anyone who kind of fits that branch would go under this category. So when we are studying the brain, we need to study all of those little nerve cells that make up the brain, and all of those thoughts and feelings that happen and actions that happen. They all come from nerve cells, also called neurons. So we have about 100 billion neurons in our brains. So we need to know first, what is a neuron, what is it made up of, and then we're going to talk about how they communicate with one another. So like I said, a neuron is a nerve cell, and there's 100 billion of those in our brain. And when we are talking about the different parts, if you're looking at this diagram, over on that left-hand side, that is where the message comes into the neuron. So chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters come in to the neuron at the dendrites, those little branches. And the dendrites take that message in and they direct it towards the soma, or the cell body. If that message is fired, if there's action potential, it sends the message along the axon of the neuron, and that myelin sheath that's wrapped around it, that speeds up neurotransmission, and then the message is sent out the axon terminals, synaptic gap. So, and then the message, or the neurotransmitter is the message gets sent along to the next neuron. And these neurons are so close together that people once thought that they actually were touching because they're so close together. It looked like the dendrites were all the way up to another neuron's like soma, but they're really not. They're super, super close, but they're not touching. That's called the synapse, the space between them. And that's where these neurotransmitters get released, these chemicals in our brain. So, how does one neuron communicate with another neuron? So how does this firing happen? So the action of firing of the chemical message is called an action potential. This can happen at like 2 miles per hour or up to 180 miles per hour. The neurons generate this electrical stimulation. So it is an all or none action, meaning it either happens or it doesn't. The best example that I've heard and that I've used is like a toilet. It either flushes or it doesn't flush. You can't just like push the toilet lever down. Think of like a public bathroom. You can't just push the lever down and it flushes harder, right? It either flushes or it does not flush. So this is that all or none. So if it reaches that threshold and it fires, this is what happens. First, obviously, the dendrite gets the message. If it meets the threshold, it fires. So it sends it along that axon. The myelin sheath wrapped around it speeds up neurotransmission. The axon terminals release the message out into the synapse, and it is collected by the next neuron. The next neuron's dendrites, right? So that's what that first picture is showing. Now, or what's happening there, is that the gates in the neuron are opening, and kind of like sewer gates, sewer lids, think of them as blowing open, and the neuron, which is at rest, negatively charged, is now being flooded with positive sodium ion. So the sodium ion is flooding the neuron's axon, and it's moving the message along very quickly. So that is the action potential. Now, once it is done doing that, there is a process called reuptake, where the sodium ions are pushed back out. And while that is happening, the neurotransmitter is in what's called a refractory period, meaning it cannot fire right now until it is restored back to where it was, being negatively charged and in a resting potential. So the types of messages that these neurons are sending, these are called neurotransmitters. These are the chemicals in our brain. So these are some important ones that you should know. I also would add substance P to this. Substance P is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for us feeling pain. And you might think that that's something, oh, well, I could do without that, right? But it's actually very important. It's critical that we feel pain so that we know when something is wrong. So you might want to write that down. Substance P, P is for pain. So acetylcholine is the first one that we'll talk about here. So that enables our muscle action, our learning, and our memory, and that is associated with Alzheimer's. So that memory factor, when there's an issue there with acetylcholine, then we can have, that is associated to, so correlated with Alzheimer's disease. So dopamine. Dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. It tells us, hey, do that thing again. It is also associated, you see there's some overlap here, with movement and learning, attention, and emotion. So emotion is really getting into that more like pleasure reward thing. So dopamine is associated with many drugs that we'll talk about in the future, especially like cocaine, for example. And so it's that thing that's saying, hey, do that again. That was very rewarding and pleasurable. It's got that, giving you that euphoric feeling to do it again. So excess dopamine, if we have too much dopamine, it doesn't mean that it will cause it. It just means that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine. Enough dopamine, they have, that is associated with Parkinson's disease. So serotonin, when you think serotonin, I want you to think happy. Serotonin, happy. So this affects our mood, our hunger, and regulates our sleep and our arousal. So if you do not have enough serotonin, this undersupply is associated with depression. If you are familiar with the term SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's a medication that is used for depression, or it's a type of medication that's used for depression, and that is because it allows the brain to keep that serotonin out there in the brain, and it allows us to lift mood. So norepinephrine, that helps us control our alertness and our arousal. If we do not have enough of this, it can depress our mood. GABA. GABA is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. Inhibitory meaning blocking. So an undersupply of this is linked to seizures, tremors, insomnia. When we're talking about alcohol, GABA is a neurotransmitter involved with alcohol. Glutamate, finally, is our major excitatory, so opposite of GABA, and that is involved in our memory. If we have an oversupply, we can overstimulate the brain. And if you've heard of a food ingredient called MSG, it is sometimes naturally occurring, it is sometimes added to food. That can be problematic to people who are prone to migraines and seizures because of this excitatory aspect of it. So those people try to avoid it. There is another neurotransmitter that I want to talk about as well, and that is endorphins. So when they were using morphine as a way to reduce pain, researchers looked into why is it that morphine, how does it work, right? And they realized that there were these opiate receptors. Our brain can receive this message. If every single one of these neurotransmitters is like a key, okay? It has like a special shape, unique shape to it that can only fit into one part of that neuron. So it's like a key into a lock. Well, then how can opiates like morphine, things that are not natural to the body, how can they help us and how can they work in our system? So they found through research on morphine that we actually have natural opiates in our system. And one of these natural opiates is endorphins. So endorphins are released when we are in pain or when we are involved in rigorous exercise. How can drugs, so something coming, an unnatural substance coming into the body, alter our neurotransmission? There are two words here you need to know: agonist and antagonist. So an agonist, it stimulates the response. It's binding to a receptor to encourage a response. So if you look at this picture here, there is the natural chemical and the agonist drug, so the foreign drug to our system, is encouraging that natural chemical to go through neurotransmission. Whereas the antagonist drug is blocking. It is not allowing that neurotransmitter to be absorbed. So these drugs, when we're talking about cocaine and any of the drugs that we'll be talking about, these are either agonist or antagonist drugs, and they are playing with our already occurring natural neurotransmitters, such as dopamine. So, for example, when dopamine is blocked, then our brain is flooded with that pleasure reward feeling, and that gives that euphoric high feeling. Why is this bad? Why wouldn't we just take artificial opiates all the time, such as morphine, to feel great and feel no pain all the time, right? Well, if we continually do this, we will actually deplete our body because it floods the system with these neurotransmitters. It depletes our system of that neurotransmitter. And it can also encourage the body to stop producing these things. So it's really not something that we want to use repeatedly if we can avoid. So takeaway, everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Key to the unit. Make sure you know the parts of the neuron and what each part is responsible for doing. Remember that neurons fire in an all or none response, just like that toilet example that I'm sure you love. After neurons fire, they go through a period known as reuptake, and that's where they cannot fire. That's the refractory period. Make sure you know those top 6 neurotransmitters and their key functions. I said 5 here because glutamate is a little less important, but then, I also added endorphins and substance P to our list. So really, I've given you 7 to be aware of. There are many more in the body, but these 7 are ones that could come up in multiple choice or in an FRQ. And then finally, know the difference between an agonist and an antagonist, and that will come up more when we are talking about different drugs. All right, I know. So that was a lot, this module. So take a deep breath and just think, you have so many nerve cells in your brain, 100 billion. You're a genius. You can handle 28 vocab. See you next time.